Don't you worry about a thing. That's a message I certainly needed to hear this morning. I don't know about all of you, but just the way that life accumulates somehow, and then you find yourself, even when you're practicing mindfulness and presence, there's this way in which, I know for me, events can start to pile up in a way where I'm looking forward and I start to contract. And it's songs like this, messages around that topic that can help me to, oh, right, I'm here to live like this, not in this way that worry would have me hold myself in and brace myself for life. Don't we want to live more like this? Well, some of us might be going, well, living like this is kind of scary, right? Living like this looks vulnerable. And I want to explore today what it is like to face our fears. You know, in Unity, there's sometimes a saying that what worry is negative prayer, you know? So we can spend our time kind of praying these positive things, but then, you know, we anticipate the next moment in the future, and we're like, and in that, what are we doing as we move into the future? We're holding ourselves in this constricted way. So today I'm going to invite myself and all of us here to take that breath that enables us to release and open into the future. So today we are in the third of a 9-week series on wholeness and the Enneagram. And so in this series, what we're looking at is really a shadow aspect of each of the personality types traced by this sacred map known as the Enneagram. You know, this map of sacred psychology that helps us to identify sort of where we are. And so being able to kind of look at what's the point of integration that enables us to kind of come from a grounded, whole, and spacious and open place into the next moment so that we can actually live our lives, you know, not like this, but like that. And so I want to, before I go into the substance of the talk, I feel like there's something I wanted to do the very first day that I'll do today, which is talk a little bit about the inner flow on the Enneagram, the arrows right there. If you look at the arrows, they point in the direction of integration. If you go in the opposite direction of those arrows, you're following what's called the inner flow. And some of us know that in the Enneagram language as the direction of disintegration. So I want to look at the Enneagram on two levels. You know, lots of us who come to this Enneagram teaching understand, oh, this is going to explain like a personality type of mind. And when we talk about the Enneagram as a map of conscious, we can like trace the lines on the map. But I want to throw a little kink into this, which is that most of the time what we do is we trace the map laterally, horizontally, rather than vertically. And by that, what I mean is, if you look at that map as a map of one person's consciousness, you can see the journey of forgetting that happens. You know, in every major spiritual tradition, there's this understanding that we have become unenlightened. We have become hidden to like our true source. And at the point of 9, that point represents having fallen asleep to source. 9 then moves in the direction of 6 as a compensatory method to be like, well, having lost sight of this, I'm going to sink into this fear-based way of being, right? And so all of us at some level do that, not just the type 6, but we'll explore that a little bit more in detail. And then from there, we develop a persona at point 3, right? So that's the inner flow in the inner triangle. But let's take it a step further and look at the point 1. If you look at the point 1, which happens to be my personality type, so at this level, you're recognizing that like, oh gosh, you know, creating a persona that's based on the world being imperfect so that I can now focus on fixing it is going to bring me fulfillment, says the type 1. But somehow, that doesn't work for some reason. You know, I've lost sight of the innate perfection of reality, so what I do is, in that moment, I move toward 4. And 4 represents this aspect of me, an aspect of consciousness that longs, that longs for that source, that somehow, you know, in the imperfection of life, I feel this deep melancholy and sadness. And somehow I look longingly within myself, but having been unable to find it as I do, the 4 then moves to 2. And the type 2, for those of you, you know, some of you are type 2s on the Enneagram, goes out into the world. It's like, I didn't find it inside me. I'm looking. There's no like origin or source here, a ground of being. And so I look out for connectedness in hopes that, hey, if I manipulate others by charming them, by meeting their needs, then my needs will be met, right? Then I will be fulfilled. But I abandon myself in reckless ways, and you know, as a type 2, as the giver on the Enneagram. And from that point, what happens is I get pissed off, and I go to 8, and the 8 is like, you know what? Enough trying to cajole and charm people. I'm going to go out and demand that I get what I want, right? I am going to dominate and control that. So the 8 has this strategy of trying to get this basic inner fulfillment through that, and unable to do that, then withdraws into the 0.5, represented by type 5. And that type withdraws into its head, saying, enough of trying to manipulate the world out there. I'm just going to think about this. And maybe if I gather enough knowledge, that I will be fulfilled. But then seeking and seeking continually, I'm still unable to find this like sense of wholeness and peace. And so I dig deeper into my mind, and then I realize, oh, well, maybe it's not just knowledge, it's practical knowledge. And so I move to 0.7, which is all about scheming for fun. I will not just think about this stuff, but I will actively plan for my good. And so the soul moves to the 7 to be constantly, compulsively focused on planning for its good. And then at 0.7, that planning kind of becomes this, well, as I plan on what could help me, I start to think that what I plan is what ought to be. And as I sort through that of what ought to be, I find myself back at type 1, the type that says, life should be like this, and I should be like that, and you should be like that for everything to be okay. And so what I have just described is the soul's unskillful journey in the horizontal plane, just trying one strategy after another, reflected in the spectrum that is each of us. And we find ourselves on one of these points, moving towards another point, moving into our point of disintegration, kind of as an unskillful way of trying to resolve what our type is missing. And I share this and the importance of this because the power of understanding the Enneagram is the power of understanding that rather than move on this horizontal plane, we can move vertically. And integration of our soul child is one way in which we embrace this vertical movement, as if you take that in the lines, and it's no longer a flat land. You've spread it out, and it's more like a slinky, and you bring it up like that. And in that, we rise into this kind of return to home and to our own wholeness. So that's the framework by which I want to share today the type 6's movement to 9. That is not just for the type 6, but reflects an aspect in each and every one of our consciousness, in the movement from all that we fear into a place of resting in the love of spirit, resting in divine love. Aesop's tales, Aesop's fables, right? These famous fables of childhood. There is a fable told of Aesop himself, in which apparently there was a certain man of Athens who came upon Aesop on the ground playing marbles with a bunch of kids. And this, esteemed gentleman points and looks and laughs at him and says, "How silly is this? Why are you playing with a bunch of kids?" And Aesop doesn't actually reply, doesn't need to defend himself, but instead he takes out a bow, an arrow, and he puts it in the middle of the street. And at this point, this guy's pretty famous and popular, so people are gathering around, but he doesn't say a word. And so he puts his bow in the street, and he just looks up at the man from Athens and watches him for a moment, looks up at him to say, well, and everyone around is trying to figure out, like, what is he trying to say? What's the lesson in that? And then finally, after people are pondering this for a while, Aesop tells them that, look, if you take this bow and you hold it taut all the time, it's going to quickly break. But if you set it down, if you let it rest, then when you need it, it will be there for you, right? It will have that flexibility. And this story, of course, reminded me of the Enneagram type 6 and the aspect of consciousness that is within all of us that holds our lives tense and taut, right? Like anxious for, is the teacher going to call on me in class? Is the boss going to call on me to do something that I don't feel skilled to do? Is my partner going to ask me to do something that I don't feel equipped or even desirous of doing? And I hold myself in anticipation of life. Am I going to need to, do I brace myself for life? Do I hold it with that anxiety of always anticipating the next moment with worry and with concern? So we all do this to some degree. The 6's happen to be experts at it, They make an identity out of it, being sort of being locked into the point at 6, at the average level of health for someone who identifies as a type 6. The main characteristics of that type is a profound skepticism about the future. And if we don't trust, like that the future is going to hold a kindness and a benevolence, if we don't even trust fully ourselves to be able to show up with the wisdom and the knowledge and the skill or the resources or even the love that we think is going to be needed in the next moment, we have this chronic sort of sense of stress and anxiety. And it said, I don't know how scientifically valid this study is, but most of the current Enneagram teachers believe that in North America, that type 6 is the predominant Enneagram type. And if you look at the bookshelves in the self-help and spiritual categories, they say that we live in the age of anxiety. That anxiety permeates our culture in the way that we create this setup so that life is not to be trusted, but read this book and develop these skills and you will be resourced and you will be ready, right? And so profoundly, as I shared earlier, if you look at it symbolically, archetypally, the type 9 that we've discussed before is the point in all of us that feels like, if there is God and a goodness, we're not connected to it. So we've sort of fallen asleep to the knowing of our oneness with this innate sense of positivity or goodness in life. And so the type 6 is a direct response to that. It's like, oh crap, right? If that's the case, I better buck up. But this is true within, again, each and every one of us. And the irony is that the next strategy is the 6 wants to move out toward the 3 and say, well, the more stressed I get, I'm going to go perform in the world. But that would be part of the lateral movement I was talking about earlier. That's a strategy of personality that just keeps us cycled on that same level. But if instead, each of us at the point of our fear, at the point of our lack of trust, the childhood message in one of these slides so the lost childhood message of every type 6 says that you aren't safe. So the corollary is that you are safe, you are okay, and you can believe in yourself. If I am one with spirit and one with wisdom, then not only am I protected in life, not only do I have that as a ground of being, but I can trust the wisdom within myself, right? So all of us, to some degree, have lost sight of that basic trust. And we just turn to different things. So the type 6 will then very much turn to the outer world. And depending on the subtype, if you're a sexual type 6, then you're going to focus on your partnership. Like, if I can check through my partner's eyes that we're okay. We were okay yesterday. We've been married 50 years, but are we okay? Like, I'm going to check that. If I could check that, then I'm going to temporarily feel that my fear is assuaged, right? But I don't feel that as a core of my being. If I'm a type 6 and I'm a social subtype, then I'm more inclined to look at, hey, have I found my people? Have I found my groups? And if I find groups where, I agree and I believe and I buy into this, and then I invest my loyalty into this group, there's this way in which that becomes my holding space and my point of security, right? And it's like, yeah, and then I rise and fall. If my team falls, boy, am I sad, right? Devastated. But as I invest in my group, I find a body of security that helps me to brace myself against this sense of lack of an inner foundation from being connected and knowing my oneness with Source. Now, if I'm a type 6 and I'm a self-preservation subtype, then my strategy is a little bit different. It's more about resources. Like, I'm going to be very preoccupied with making sure my home, my hearth, my financial security is in place, that my body and its future potential degradation, if you will, is going to be pre-planned for, right? That I'm going to make sure I have the right health care that's needed to preserve all this. So my security, again, is still in the outer. And so each of us does this in some way, right? The 6s just sort of make a living out of it. Like, it becomes a hyper-focus for those where it's the personality type in this way. But each of us, I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area when the market tanked in 2008. And boy, these people, these 20-something-year-olds who had millions of dollars invested, lost everything practically overnight. So they had a very direct experience of losing this illusion of, like, you can amass that much and not actually be financially secure. That's the truth of life, is it not? And sometimes we experience these outer losses to really, force us to confront what's an existential reality, that nothing in the outer world is secure, right? Nothing is. And so our way of awakening to an inner groundedness and peace cannot be in any of those outer things. Alliances and friendships. How many folks who have had friends since they were kids, only to find that now this group that I connected with, that I allied with, that I saw, or even my family unit as the ground of my being, well, somebody deeply disappointed me. Sometimes that disappointment isn't just like an ideological one, but it could be. It could be that you discover that they're on the, quote, wrong side of the political spectrum, and now you're devastated because these are no longer my people. And the loss of that means there's an instability for myself, right? The loss of that sense of my community creates like an instability because I placed my stability in the group. How many of us have lost childhood friends, or even going into self-preservation? The loss for many of us isn't ideological, but the sheer fact that someone passed away causes us to have to confront this. We cannot, but one time when, right after law school, I believe, I tried to cook for one of the first times in my life. My mom was this great cook, and some of you have heard this story. And my mom was about to visit, I think, that weekend, but I tried cooking one of her dishes, which are these famous Vietnamese egg rolls. That was the reason we all got good grades, because we brought egg rolls to school, And I tried to cook these and was so scattered and new to cooking, I ended up burning. The whole stovetop went on fire. I left it, and the oil burned and started heating up on fire. And so I acted quickly. And what I did was I grabbed the container and I ran to the sliding glass door, and I ran into the door instead of through it with a boiling pot of oil. And the oil splashed up and onto my skin. And fortunately, I backed up enough that there's still a scar on my wrist here. But what was interesting about that, because I was like, oh shoot, and I went to urgent care. Those of you who know me know that I'm like, oh, my body, it hurts, okay, I was like, oh, I guess that's a second degree, third degree burn, okay. I wasn't really that focused, but my mom's comment really struck me. And she said to me, God, all I want to do is protect my children. But you really can't protect your children. All these years, all she wanted to do was protect me from physical harm. There's something about how she would feel in the ways of that safety and protection. And I was so moved by that. I don't think I had any idea, I think the way that my mom loved me in that way, that she wanted to protect me from that physical harm, from destroying myself, if you will. And in these ways, don't we all have these ways we want to preserve, make stable, find security? And we want it so deeply that most of us scurry around in our respective ways. When I first started my spiritual journey back in 2004, my conscious spiritual journey, I was working at a law firm in San Francisco, and I remember when I had all of this inner stuff arise for the first time, stuff that I was beginning to look at in myself, it felt so overwhelming that I just wanted to stay home. It was like that was enough work. Now I had to go to this law firm and work 60 hours a week. And all I wanted to do was stay home. But I remember telling a dear friend and spiritual mentor at the time that I was scared to death of that. Because everything I had built for my life that made me feel confident and secure was because of that work ethic, was because I knew how to show up like that, and I knew how to work fairly manically, and this fear that if I went home more, if I let myself rest, I would never get up again. If I let myself get sad, maybe I'd never pull myself up again, right? And this fear that kept me from fully entering it until I had friends who convinced me, who convinced me because they had taken the journey themselves, right? And by having taken it, they were a little further along the spiritual journey. I'm like, well, there's hope because they've done something like this. And that's what spiritual community gave for me, sort of a vision of other people who couldn't do this inner journey for me, but who maybe walked ahead of me. And it was like, keep going, and going actually means standing still. And I share this story in part because for the Enneagram personality type 6, the path home, the path up rather than out to more ways of building security in the world is to stop the fretting, is to stop the acting upon the fretting and the worry and instead find a place of rest, and specifically resting in the love that is symbolized at point 9. Now, when we began this particular Enneagram series, I shared that what happens to each personality type early on is that what we shut out never grows up. And so early on in life, when the 6 is like, hey, the world is not safe, so I'm not resting. My mind, even if I'm sitting here, my mind is not resting. And the more I'm around people who like to rest themselves, the more I have to frantically worry about everybody else around me as an act of love. So I'm going to freak out right now and think about all the things, the ways in which I can guard myself and everyone I love against danger. So even if I'm sitting still, my mind is going to churn out of love and out of a sort of almost motherly protective energy of like, I'm going to take care of these babies because they don't realize, like how fully dangerous and scary the world is. And so in that place, early on, I as a 6, again, embodying that for each of us, at the point 6, what I've done is I have repressed and suppressed the part in me that wants to relax, the part in me that is tired of having to think for everybody else because nobody seems to be worried enough, and so in this moment, that soul child of mine is sitting there and hasn't grown up, hasn't matured into maybe, a healthier expression of rest, of sacred rest. And so as a 6, when I first begin to stop and not let my mind go into all those places, the first thing that happens is I perceive within myself this extraordinarily lazy soul child. And this sense that if I give in to that, all this kid wants to do is lounge around, maybe eat some bonbons, and just like have everybody else take care of things. And if that's the case, though, then I won't be the responsible person I've been. What will happen? So, if we have 6s in our lives, or we are 6s, the importance, again, every week I've done this, with the 9s, learning how to stand on stage, we got to give them a little slack if they're a little bit loud and talk too much in the beginning, right? For the 3s who then have to learn to enter into their fears, we have to let the 3s have room to be frantically fearful. Like that's a space that to let them feel into the vulnerability of that beyond all their successes in the world. And now for the 6, the same thing of really deeply comprehending the fear, because 6s are known to, at the average level of health, have something that's called paralysis analysis, right? Analysis paralysis. And in that, there's a fear that if I stop, that's what it looks like. It looks like the times when I was just stuck, right? But this is different, because this is not cycling in our heads. This is resting, but resting in what? The 6 doesn't even know. And each of us, returning to point 6 within ourselves, doesn't even know point 9. Our whole personality's construct was designed to compensate for having lost sight of the holy love, the oneness at point 9. And so we gently hold space for the 6 point in all of us that fears, if I don't use my life strategy, whatever it is, keep going, right? To make things okay, to make things safe and secure, to secure love, to secure finances, to secure physical well-being. If I don't do that, it will not be okay. And so to gently allow ourselves the space of moving into, not over-analysis, but beyond that, into a place of resting in love. And the way we do that is the willingness to go into the silence, not just outer silence. And in fact, you can sometimes do it without outer silence, but inner silence. To be willing to say that the mind that races and tells me, no, this is important, and that is important, and you need to be doing this right now, that we can trust enough and take that leap of faith to say, maybe not. Maybe it's going to be okay if I'm not so responsible in this moment. Maybe it would be okay if I let that thought just float on by instead of grab hold of it and march out into the world equipped with it, right? Maybe I can rest in something, and if I stay still enough, maybe what Nhien was talking about will actually arise for me. And this thing called love is something I might actually feel at the very ground of my being. Holy love. Love that does not discriminate. Love that is deeply within me and within everything and everyone in my life. If that's true, what am I guarding myself against? Courage, which is the virtue of the 6, is expressed at its highest level as the courage to know one's true nature. And that courage demands that we journey through that false sense of self and all the stories and lies that it would tell us, and the ways it will validate those lies, because, hey, Nhien, as this attorney, this is how I've gotten this far in my life. Who's to say I should throw out the strategy? Most of us aren't even willing to throw out the strategy until it breaks, right? Until we come to a point where we've been doing it based on what my ego tells me is the way I'm going to find this joy, happiness, and love. And somehow I'm not fulfilled, right? It takes that to be like, maybe I will try another way. Maybe I will support others so that we are not on this, sort of hamster wheel together, but we can practice this thing of resting. And in that place of rest, that personality type 6 starts to embody some of the most radiant and beautiful qualities, found in the 9. What is the 9 known for? It's the peacemaker. It's the harmonizer of the Enneagram. But 9-ishness in all of us is this deep, profound peace of being and oneness. So from a Christian perspective, and even from the Enneagram's wisdom perspective, the term is divine love. So what does it mean to find security within ourselves? This is not a matter of finding security in our bodies, which can get injured, become sick, and always die, nor in our abilities or our skills, since these are just the expression of who we are. Rather, it lies in finding out what our nature really is and discovering that in that lies our only true safety. And I can read that again and again and teach it again and again. And tomorrow I might wake up and think, my safety lies in my job and doing well in my job. My safety lies in that bank account. And if it starts to go down, I'm going to get a little worried. And sure, at a certain level of reality, like that relative experience in life is important. It's not like we dismiss it altogether. But when we come to rely upon it, we rely on something that can be so taken away from us at any moment. And so there is a way in which we can find a ground of being in the deeper knowing of ourselves while still doing the work and trusting ourselves to do the work in order to build all those outer additions in our lives. But none of those things can give any of us that inner ground of being, that knowing our true self can. And I want to share. The Buddhist tradition has this amazing notion of inter-arising. That's what it is. And I love the compatibility of this teaching with the Buddhist tradition. I was reading an article that was published through a series of essays by the Omega Institute and Lion's Roar. It's an online Buddhist publication. And it talked about moving from fear to fearlessness. And I was astounded to see this commonality. It said, in the end, it's not about like going into the space of fearlessness is actually about not conquering our fears. And when we can do that, we can be a daredevil and do all these ways to try to make ourselves feel courageous in the world. But the true conquering of this fear is actually where we come to see that there is no subject and no object to fear, but there is only oneness, inter-arising, that all of life is simply one power arising. And so this is the same thing as integrating love and knowing that we are one in spirit. So this idea that as I sit and face my fears, what if instead of taking that movement and facing my fears, I can instead rest in love to remember my fear is baseless because there is nothing outside of me. As A Course in Miracles says, nothing real can be threatened and nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. What if all this story we have about the ways in which we're separate from that outside us, and we need to gather resources or make something happen in order to be okay, what if that were the lie? And instead, we can fall back into the place where subject, I, and the object of my fear merge into one and inter-arise. And I love that term because there's an organic way in which, that doesn't mean we don't do anything. That means we move from a place of oneness that is not moving the way fear makes us move. And so let's take the opportunity now to practice this. I'll invite us into a time of meditation, but I invite you in particular to maybe bring forth in your consciousness something that you've actively been like, oh no, only when I have that will I be able to rest. And maybe bringing that and finding a way in which instead of compulsively thinking about that or trying to act on that, finding a place within you where you can rest in oneness, and then right action can then spontaneously arise. As you bring your attention gently back into the space of this room, I invite you, if you're willing, to make a commitment to yourself this week, to take some time each day to rest in the presence of love within yourself. Remembering to breathe out worry, anxiety, and breathe in peace and love.
No need to push, no need to try, no need to worry or question why. Surrender, let go, release, and know. Breathe, breathe, breathe,
And when you find that you don't know what to do, breathing is a great idea this week. Peace, blessings. Thank you for joining us here today.